Another well-known creed is the Nicene Creed. What do we know about that, its history? And tell us about this one, Nate.
Yeah, so that actually has a longer, more storied history. It's a fascinating story. But the long and the short of it is that in the early fourth century, a bishop or a teacher, I should say, named Arius began teaching what later became known to be heresy. And he was approached by his bishop, which is Alexander of Alexandria. Having your name and your city in the same thing is pretty cool, I guess. But Alexander confronted him, and it just began to unravel to the point where Constantine, who was the new emperor of the Roman Empire, wanted to maintain unity and peace, but also make sure that, orthodoxy was established. And so he convened a council of, we think, about 220 bishops from all over the known world. And they came together and they began to talk about just a essential doctrine. And then within that, examine the doctrine that Arius was teaching. And the key issue was, well, who is Jesus? That's really what this is all about, is the identity of Christ. Is Jesus simply a man who was especially graced by God? And Arius was, famous for saying there once was a time when Jesus, was not, that somehow Jesus had an origin, he had a birth, and that he came into being at some point. And the Nicene Fathers rejected that. And they evaluated Scripture. They evaluated how they've always understood that Scripture. And basically, by the end of the council in 325, they deemed Arius to be a heretic. And then they wrote what was called the Creed of Nicaea, which elucidated all that doctrine. And then later on in a different council, they revised and sort of modified. And so what we know to be the Nicene Creed is actually a later version of the Nicene Creed. But that's really it, is, who is Jesus, and how do we understand the person, the being of Jesus? Is he just a man, or is he God in human flesh? And that was where they landed. So, yeah.
Yeah. And interestingly, a lot of Jehovah's Witness doctrine actually points back to Arius. Is that right?
Yeah. So again, and I'm sure we'll talk about this later, but every major heresy that has impact always attacks the nature, the personhood of Christ. It's interesting because they won't oftentimes go after the Father or even the Spirit, but they will go after the Son because it impacts the gospel, and that's a tool of the enemy. So, it's still very popular. Funny story. I was just recently at a bookstore, a local bookstore, and it was called the Arian Bible, the Arian Christian Bible. And I'm like, what is that? And I pulled it off the shelf, and it was, 1700-year-old heresy reprinted. And it's like, it's still circulating. And it's like, my goodness, this just won't go away. But it's not orthodox theology at all.